The internet is absolutely melting down right now, and if you've been anywhere near women's basketball conversations lately, you already know exactly why. Sophie Cunningham just made a move that has people either celebrating like crazy or reacting like someone just took their remote control away mid-game. And let's be real, there is no in-between here. She's officially joining USA Network as a studio contributor for their upcoming WNBA coverage. And the reaction? Let's just say it didn't take long for social media to split straight down the middle. On one side, you've got fans calling it a perfect fit, a smart career move, and a sign that the sport is finally recognizing personalities that actually bring eyes to the game. On the other side, yeah, absolute chaos. We're talking posts, threads, and clips flying everywhere. There's people complaining, people arguing, people acting like this announcement personally ruined their day. And honestly, the reaction was so predictable, it almost feels scripted. Every time Sophie Cunningham's name trends, it follows the same pattern. Excitement from new fans, frustration from old-school voices, and a flood of opinions from people who suddenly become experts on what the league should or shouldn't be doing. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because this isn't just about a broadcasting job. It's about timing. It's about visibility. And it's about the fact that women's basketball is going through a massive shift where personality might be just as valuable as performance when it comes to growing the audience. And Sophie Cunningham, she's right in the center of that storm. Some people are calling her the perfect bridge between casual fans and the league itself. Others are saying she's being pushed into a spotlight she doesn't deserve. But whether you love it or hate it, one thing is already clear. This announcement is not just a small media update. It's a signal. A signal that the WNBA's new era of broadcasting personalities and fan engagement is officially taking shape. And Sophie Cunningham is becoming one of its most talked about faces. And if you think the reaction you're seeing now is intense, just wait. Because this story is only getting started, and what happens next is going to make this announcement look like the calm before a much bigger storm. To really understand why Sophie Cunningham's USA Network announcement has sparked such a loud reaction, you have to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of where women's basketball is right now. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum. The WNBA has been going through a massive transformation over the past few seasons. Not just in terms of talent, but in terms of attention, media coverage, and the kind of personalities driving conversations online. And in the middle of all that change, certain players have started to stand out for reasons that go way beyond the box score. Sophie Cunningham is one of those names. Now, for longtime fans of the league, Sophie has always been known as a tough, competitive guard. Someone who plays with edge, intensity, and zero fear of confrontation on the court. She's not the type of player who quietly blends into the background. She's involved in the energy of the game, the physicality, hence in the moments that often become talking points after the final buzzer. But over the last couple of years, her profile started shifting in a way that nobody really predicted. Because while her on-court role stayed consistent, her visibility off the court started growing rapidly. And a big reason for that shift is simple: attention. Women's basketball has entered a new era where attention is currency. Social media clips travel faster than game recaps. Viral moments can define public perception more than full seasons. And personalities that generate conversation, whether positive or negative, end up shaping the broader narrative of the league. Sophie Cunningham accidentally stepped right into that space. A few on-court moments that went viral, a growing online fan base, and a sudden surge in recognition from casual viewers who didn't necessarily follow every team, but did follow highlights, drama, and standout personalities. And once that kind of visibility starts building, it rarely slows down. At the same time, the WNBA itself was entering a new broadcast era. Media rights deals were expanding, networks were competing for coverage, and platforms were actively searching for personalities who could connect with a broader audience. Not just hardcore fans, but also the new wave of viewers who had started paying attention to the league more recently. That's where Sophie becomes particularly interesting in this conversation. Because she isn't just an athlete anymore in the eyes of the media ecosystem. She's become a recognizable voice, a personality, and someone who already has experience in front of a camera through commentary appearances and media work. And that matters a lot more than people realize. In modern sports broadcasting, networks aren't only looking for former stars with resumes. They're looking for people who can translate the game in a way that feels relatable, engaging, and entertaining for audiences who might not understand every technical detail. Sophie fits into that evolving model almost perfectly. But of course, not everyone sees it that way. Because every time a player transitions into media work while still active in the league, the reaction becomes divided. Some people see it as smart career building, a sign that athletes are expanding their influence beyond the court. And others see it as unnecessary spotlight allocation, especially when they believe other former players or retired veterans should be prioritized instead. And that's where the tension starts to build around announcements like this one. It's not really about Sophie alone. It's about what she represents in a changing media landscape. A landscape where personality, marketability, and fan engagement sometimes matter just as much as long-term legacy or traditional credentials. And that shift naturally creates debate. On top of that, Sophie Cunningham also has something else working in her favor: visibility through association. Playing alongside high-profile names in the league means she's already been part of moments that casual fans recognize. And in the modern sports world, recognition often becomes the bridge between athletic performance and media opportunity. But with recognition also comes criticism, because the more visible a player becomes, the more opinions get attached to them, whether they asked for it or not. And that's exactly what has happened here. So when the USA Network announcement dropped, it didn't just land as Sophie gets a job in broadcasting. It landed as a symbol of something bigger happening in women's basketball. A shift in who gets media opportunities, a shift in what kind of personalities networks want to feature, and a shift in how the sport is being presented to a rapidly expanding audience. For some fans, that's exciting. For others, it's frustrating. And for a loud portion of social media, it became another reason to argue. Which brings us right to the moment everything started to escalate, when the announcement stopped being just news and started becoming a full-blown online debate that split fans into completely different camps. The moment Sophie Cunningham's USA Network announcement hit the internet, it didn't just get likes and shares. It triggered a reaction cycle. Fast, loud, and completely predictable. Within minutes, clips, screenshots, and reposts were everywhere, not just reporting the news, but interpreting it, reacting to it, and turning it into a debate about what it really means for women's basketball. At first, it looked like normal engagement. Fans congratulating her. Some people saying it's a smart move. Others pointing out that she's been building a media presence for a while now. But then the tone shifted. And that's where the first real conflict begins. Because suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about Sophie Cunningham getting a broadcasting role. It became about whether she deserved it. And in today's sports media environment, that question alone is enough to ignite a fire. One group of fans framed it as simple logic. Sophie is relatable, outspoken, and already comfortable on camera. She connects with newer audiences. She's part of the modern wave of players who understand both performance and personality. Another group pushed back immediately, arguing that media opportunities in sports should prioritize retired legends, veteran analysts, and former players with deeper statistical resumes or long-term league impact. And just like that, the announcement stopped being neutral news. It became a referendum on value. So not just Sophie's value, but what the league values. And that's where things get even more complicated, because women's basketball is currently in a rare moment of explosive growth. More viewers, more media deals, more attention than it's ever had before. And whenever a sport grows this fast, it goes through identity tension between traditional structures and new age popularity dynamics. Sophie Cunningham has become an unexpected symbol of that tension. Not because she asked for it, but because she's visible in the exact right, or wrong, depending on who you ask, moment. As the debate escalated, social media started doing what it always does. turning opinions into narratives. Posts began suggesting she was being pushed into media over more qualified voices. Others responded by pointing out that she's been doing broadcast-style commentary for years in smaller roles, and that experience actually matters more than people want to admit. Then came the twist that pushed everything further. Old clips of Sophie's candid personality started circulating again. Moments where she spoke openly, confidently, and without filter during interviews and podcast appearances. For her supporters, those clips were proof that she's exactly the kind of voice sports broadcasting needs right now. Authentic, unfiltered, and willing to say what others avoid. For critics, those same clips became evidence that she's being elevated more for personality than expertise. And suddenly, the debate wasn't about the announcement anymore. It was about her entire public identity. That's when the reaction became more intense. Yet because now it wasn't just fans of Sophie Cunningham responding. It was general sports fans, WNBA viewers, casual observers, and even people who don't regularly follow the league. All weighing in on what kind of voices should be amplified in sports media. And as the engagement grew, so did the divide. One side argued that women's basketball needs personalities who bring attention and energy, especially in a market where competition for viewership is higher than ever. The other side insisted that growth should not come at the expense of tradition, credibility, and respect for former players who helped build the league from earlier eras. Both sides believed they were defending the future of the sport. But neither side was willing to compromise. And that's what turned a simple announcement into a full-blown cultural debate. Meanwhile, Sol USA Network quietly stood by the decision, highlighting Sophie's role as a studio contributor for their expanded WNBA coverage. The deal itself is part of a much larger media expansion. More games, more broadcasts, more visibility than the league has ever had before. But that detail got buried quickly. Because online attention doesn't focus on structure. It focuses on emotion. And Sophie Cunningham sits right at the center of that emotional overlap between sports performance, personality-driven media, and fan culture that is now deeply influenced by viral moments rather than just game outcomes. As the debate intensified, another layer got added: comparison culture. Fans started comparing her media opportunity to other former players, analysts, and well-known names who have previously worked in broadcasting. And names started getting thrown around. Arguments started forming about who should have gotten it instead. And once that comparison cycle begins, the original story almost disappears entirely. At this point, Sophie herself wasn't doing anything new publicly. No controversial statements, no interviews fueling the fire, no escalation from her side. But the internet didn't need new information anymore. It had already built the narrative. And that's the second twist. Because the controversy isn't actually about what she did. It's about what she represents in a league that is rapidly evolving in real time. A league where new audiences are reshaping demand, where networks are chasing engagement, and where visibility sometimes outweighs traditional expectations. And whether people like it or not, Sophie Cunningham is now one of the clearest examples of that shift. Which brings everything to an even bigger question that nobody can fully answer yet. Is this the future of women's basketball broadcasting? Or just the beginning of a much bigger identity battle inside the sport itself? And as that question spreads across social media, the reaction only grows louder, more divided, and more emotionally charged, setting the stage for an even bigger wave of public and industry reactions. Next, what makes this situation even more interesting is that once you look past the headline, you start to see a much bigger shift happening behind the scenes in women's basketball media. Because Sophie Cunningham's move to USA Network isn't just a personal win. It's part of a larger pattern that's been building for a while now, quietly, on almost underneath the surface while most fans were focused only on what happens during games. Broadcasting in sports is changing fast, and the WNBA is right in the middle of that transformation. For years, coverage of the league followed a very traditional formula. Former players, usually the most decorated or most recognizable names, would transition into commentary roles after retirement. The focus was heavily analytical, often very structured, and sometimes even distant from the casual viewer who was just discovering the sport. But now that model is being challenged. Networks are starting to realize something very important. The modern sports audience doesn't just want analysis. They want personality. They want energy. They want relatability. They want voices that feel like they're part of the same world as the players and the fans. And Sophie Cunningham represents exactly that shift. She's part of a generation of players who grew up in the social media era, where visibility matters just as much as performance. Every interaction, every post, every appearance builds a larger public identity beyond the court. And whether people like it or not, that identity has become a major part of sports culture today. USA Network didn't just randomly select her. They selected someone who already exists inside that intersection between athlete, personality, and media presence. And that's where things start to get even more interesting. Because once the announcement dropped, the reaction wasn't just excitement. It exposed a divide in how people see the future of the WNBA. On one side, there's a growing audience that sees moves like this as exactly what the league needs. Not more visibility, more personalities, more crossover appeal. They see Sophie's role as a bridge between hardcore fans and casual viewers who are just starting to pay attention. On the other side, there are traditional fans who feel like the focus is shifting too far away from the game itself and toward entertainment-driven storytelling. They worry that broadcasting decisions are starting to prioritize marketability over legacy, statistics, or long-term contribution to the sport. And that tension is where the real story is. Because Sophie Cunningham has become a symbol, whether she asked for it or not, of how quickly the league is evolving. But here's the part that really shifts the conversation. This isn't happening in isolation. The WNBA is currently in one of its biggest growth phases in history. Attendance is up. Viewership is expanding. A social media engagement is exploding. And new media deals are pushing the league into markets and audiences it never reached before. That kind of growth always changes who gets spotlighted. And more importantly, how they get spotlighted. Sophie's role at USA Network is a direct reflection of that evolution. She isn't just there to break down plays. She's there to be part of the broadcast identity itself. That means storytelling, reactions, chemistry on air, and the ability to connect with viewers who may not even be hardcore basketball fans. And that's where the shock factor really comes in. Because what's happening here is bigger than one player getting a media job. It's the beginning of a new type of sports media personality emerging inside women's basketball. One that blends active playing careers with broadcasting roles, on public personas with real-time competition, and athletic identity with entertainment influence. That overlap is something we've seen in other sports, but it's now becoming much more visible in the WNBA specifically. And Sophie is one of the first active players to sit right at the center of it. Now here's where the narrative takes another turn. Because as this announcement spread, it also reignited conversations about how the league is being marketed overall. Not just who gets coverage, but why certain players are chosen for spotlight roles while others remain less visible despite their achievements. This is where things get complicated. Some argue that media opportunities like this naturally go to players who are already popular with casual audiences. Others argue that this reinforces popularity loops, where visibility creates more visibility, and the same names continue to dominate attention across both playing and broadcasting spaces. And Sophie Cunningham sits right in the middle of that debate. She isn't the league's most decorated player. She isn't the statistical leader. But she is undeniably one of the most recognizable personalities in the modern WNBA ecosystem. And that recognition matters more than ever in today's media landscape. Because sports networks are no longer just selling games, they're selling experiences. And experiences are built around voices, faces, and personalities that viewers remember even after the broadcast ends. That's why her transition into USA Network coverage feels so significant. It's not just a job, it's a signal. A signal that the league is actively expanding the definition of what a basketball figure looks like in the media era. But there's another layer here that often gets overlooked. This kind of visibility also changes how players are perceived long-term. Once an athlete becomes part of mainstream broadcasting, their influence extends beyond wins and losses. They become part of the cultural framing of the sport itself. Every opinion they give, every breakdown they deliver, every moment on screen contributes to how millions of viewers understand the game. That's a powerful position to hold. And it's one that Sophie is stepping into while still actively competing, which is rare. Most athletes don't begin this transition until after retirement. But the modern media environment is speeding everything up. Careers are overlapping, yet roles are blending, and the line between player and personality is becoming thinner by the season. And that's where the real shock comes in. Because what looks like a simple broadcast announcement is actually part of a much larger shift in how sports careers are structured in real time. It raises a bigger question. Are we watching the beginning of dual-career athletes becoming normal in the WNBA? Players who are not just competing on the court, but simultaneously building media platforms, broadcast roles, and long-term entertainment careers while still in uniform? If the answer is yes, then Sophie Cunningham is one of the early examples of that future taking shape. And that changes everything, because it means the value of a player is no longer defined only by performance metrics, but also by influence, reach, and cultural presence. And whether people are ready for that shift or not, it's already happening. USA Network didn't just add a contributor. They added a personality who represents a new direction for the league. And that direction is only going to become more visible as the season unfolds. Because once networks start building around this model, they don't go backward. They expand it, they refine it, and they push it further into mainstream sports culture. So what looks like a single announcement today might actually be the first step in a much larger transformation happening right in front of us. And if that's true, then this isn't the peak of Sophie Cunningham's media presence. It might just be the beginning. Once the announcement fully settled in, the reaction wasn't just immediate, it was everywhere. Across sports media, social platforms, and basketball circles, Sophie Cunningham's move to USA Network quickly became one of the most discussed storylines in women's basketball coverage that week. And what stood out wasn't just the news itself. It was how divided the response became depending on who you asked. Because this wasn't a quiet, nice career step kind of moment. This turned into a full conversation about where the WNBA is heading. On one side, media analysts and broadcasting insiders saw the move as a strategic win for both Sophie and the network. From their perspective, it made perfect sense. The WNBA is expanding its audience faster than ever, and networks are actively looking for voices that can bridge the gap between hardcore basketball fans and the newer, more casual viewers who are just tuning in. To them, Sophie represented exactly that bridge. She's a current player. She understands locker room dynamics. She knows modern game tempo, and at the same time, she has a personality that translates well on camera, direct, expressive, and comfortable in front of a microphone. For broadcasters, that combination is rare. One analyst described the move as a modern media decision for a modern league, emphasizing that traditional broadcasting models are no longer enough on their own. The league, in their view, needs voices that feel active, relevant, and connected to the current generation of players. And Sophie fits into that category naturally. But while media professionals were focused on strategy, fan reactions told a much more chaotic story. On social platforms, the response split into multiple directions almost instantly. A large group of fans celebrated the announcement, viewing it as a positive step for visibility in women's basketball. They saw Sophie Cunningham's growing media presence as proof that the league is expanding beyond just game coverage and into full entertainment territory. For these fans, her presence on USA Network wasn't controversial at all. It was exciting. They liked her energy, they liked her confidence, and they liked the idea of hearing unfiltered player-level insight during broadcasts instead of overly polished commentary. They saw authenticity. They saw personality. They saw progress. But not everyone agreed. Another segment of fans questioned the decision from a traditional standpoint, arguing that broadcasting roles should primarily go to retired legends or historically decorated players with long-term statistical impact. Their concern wasn't necessarily about Sophie herself. It was about the direction of media selection in general. To them, the question wasn't, is she good on TV? The question was, is this the best representation of the league's history and talent? And that debate quickly escalated into a broader discussion about how sports leagues balance legacy versus popularity. Because Sophie Cunningham's rise in media visibility is closely tied to something much bigger happening in the WNBA right now: the rapid expansion of its casual fan base. In recent seasons, the league has seen a surge in viewers who don't necessarily follow every team or every stat line, but instead follow storylines, personalities, and viral moments. That audience consumes basketball differently. They engage with clips, highlights, reactions, even commentary rather than full games alone. And that shift changes everything about what broadcasters prioritize. Industry executives know this better than anyone. Internally, sports networks have increasingly emphasized viewer retention personalities. People who don't just explain the game, but hold attention. Sophie Cunningham, in this context, is seen as someone who naturally fits that category. But that also creates tension with longtime fans who feel the league risks losing part of its traditional identity in the process. And that tension became very visible in how the announcement was discussed. Some former players and analysts defended the decision, pointing out that the modern sports media landscape has evolved far beyond pure credentials. They argued that communication skills, relatability, and on-camera presence now matter just as much as playing accolades. One former broadcaster summed it up by saying that being great at basketball doesn't automatically mean being great at explaining basketball to millions of viewers. And in their view, Sophie brings both understanding and accessibility. Meanwhile, other voices in the basketball community raised concerns about how quickly active players are being integrated into media roles. They questioned whether balancing playing commitments with broadcasting duties could eventually blur focus or create conflicts of interest in coverage. Even though similar dual roles have existed in other sports, they argued that the WNBA is now entering a phase where that overlap is becoming more visible and potentially more influential. But despite the debate, one thing was impossible to ignore: the attention itself. Because whether people were praising the move or criticizing it, everyone was talking about it. And in modern sports media, attention is the most valuable currency. Networks noticed, sponsors noticed, even rival leagues and commentators took note of how quickly Sophie Cunningham's name circulated outside of traditional basketball circles. And that is ultimately what made this moment so significant. It wasn't just a broadcast announcement. It was a visibility event. A cultural crossover moment that pulled together sports fans, media analysts, and casual viewers into the same conversation at the same time. And in the middle of all of it, Sophie Cunningham found herself becoming something more than just a player or a contributor. She became a reference point in a much larger discussion about where women's basketball is headed next. Some saw it as progress, some saw it as disruption, some saw it as a shift that was overdue. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: this wasn't going to be the last time a move like this happens. Because once the league starts successfully merging active players with broadcast roles, the model becomes hard to ignore. And Sophie Cunningham is now one of the first visible examples of that model working in real time. Whether the conversation calms down or intensifies from here, one thing is certain: the industry is watching closely, and the next move might be even bigger than this one. Or just when the conversation around Sophie Cunningham's USA Network move seemed like it might settle into a normal media cycle story, something unexpected started to happen behind the scenes that changed how people were interpreting the entire situation. Because this wasn't just about a broadcast role anymore. It was becoming something bigger, something layered, something that hinted at a shift in how the entire WNBA ecosystem is being structured going forward. And the first clue didn't come from a press release or an official statement. It came from scheduling behavior. People inside the media space began noticing subtle patterns in how USA Network was positioning its WNBA coverage. Certain matchups were being highlighted more aggressively. Certain promotional clips were leaning heavily into personality-driven storytelling. And certain names, especially those already drawing strong audience engagement, were being featured more prominently in marketing material. And Sophie Cunningham was suddenly appearing everywhere in that ecosystem. Not just in announcements, not just in commentary roles, but in promotional framing, teaser content, and early broadcast planning discussions that suggested her presence wasn't just temporary or experimental. It was being integrated. At first, that didn't seem unusual. Networks often test personalities to see how they perform with audiences. But what made this different was the consistency. Sophie wasn't just being used as a guest contributor or occasional analyst. She was being positioned as a recurring identity within the coverage structure itself. And that's where industry observers started asking a deeper question. Was this just a broadcasting hire? Or the beginning of a long-term media strategy centered around active players? Because if it was the second option, then Sophie Cunningham wasn't just stepping into a role. She was stepping into a prototype. A test case for how far active WNBA players could be integrated into mainstream sports broadcasting while still competing professionally. And that idea alone changed how analysts were viewing the announcement. But the real twist came when conversations began surfacing about timing. Because Sophie's media deal wasn't happening in isolation. It was arriving at a moment when the WNBA itself is undergoing major structural growth. New media rights deals, expanded national coverage, increased international interest, and a rapidly growing casual fan base have all combined to push the league into a completely different commercial category than it was just a few years ago. And in that environment, visibility is everything. Not just for the league, but for individual players. Which is where things get interesting. Because sources within the broader sports media industry began suggesting that Sophie Cunningham's expanded role might not be the only one of its kind in development. While nothing official was confirmed, the idea that other active players could eventually be integrated into similar broadcast roles started gaining traction among commentators and analysts. Not as a replacement for traditional broadcasting talent, but as an additional layer. A hybrid model where players become both participants and narrators of the sport simultaneously. And if that model expands, it fundamentally changes how fans experience basketball coverage. Instead of retired voices exclusively interpreting the game, viewers would also hear from players who are actively shaping the season in real time. That creates a different type of broadcast energy, more immediate, more reactive, and potentially more unpredictable. And Sophie Cunningham is now directly connected to that shift, whether intentionally or not. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because as her media presence started gaining momentum, another conversation quietly began circulating in basketball circles. What happens when a player becomes too visible across multiple platforms at once? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer. On one hand, visibility increases value. It expands reach, builds brand identity, and strengthens long-term career opportunities beyond playing. But on the other hand, it also changes perception. When a player becomes a media figure while still actively competing, every action on the court begins to carry an additional layer of scrutiny. Every performance is analyzed not only as athletic output, but as part of a larger public persona. And that can create pressure in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. Some analysts started quietly debating whether this dual-role structure could eventually impact how players are evaluated, both by fans and by organizations. Because once a player becomes a media presence, their influence extends beyond stats. They become part of the narrative machinery of the league itself, and that is a powerful position to occupy. Perhaps too powerful for some environments. Which leads to the final question that now sits at the center of this entire situation. Is Sophie Cunningham's USA Network role simply a smart career move, or the first step in a full structural change in how the WNBA connects players to media influence? Because if it's the second option, then what we're seeing right now is not just a one-off announcement. It's the beginning of a system where players are no longer confined to one lane, athlete or analyst, but instead operate across both simultaneously, shaping how the sport is played and how it is presented at the same time. And if that system continues to expand, it could redefine what it means to be a professional basketball player in the modern era. But here's the part that makes everything more uncertain. No one knows how far it will go. Networks are still experimenting. Our players are still adapting. And audiences are still deciding how they feel about this new hybrid identity emerging inside the sport. And Sophie Cunningham, whether intentionally or not, has become one of the first visible figures standing right at the center of that experiment. Which brings us to the final moment, the part that hasn't been answered yet. Because even though the announcement has already been made, and the reactions have already spread, and the industry has already started analyzing the implications, the real outcome hasn't happened yet. It will happen when the season begins. When Sophie steps into the broadcast booth while still actively competing on the court. When viewers see her switching between roles in real time. When her influence starts being measured not just by commentary impact, but by how audiences respond to this new blended format of sports coverage. And that's where the real cliffhanger sits. Because if this works, it won't stay limited to Sophie Cunningham. Other players will follow, the model will expand, and the entire structure of WNBA media coverage could shift faster than anyone expected. But if it doesn't work, if the audience rejects the hybrid format, if the balance between playing and broadcasting becomes too complicated, then this moment will be remembered as an experiment that arrived too early. Either way, the league is now standing at a turning point. And Sophie Cunningham is already at the center of it. So the only thing left to do now is watch what happens next, because the story isn't finished yet, not even close. Now, before this story moves any further and the next wave of reactions starts rolling in, there's one thing worth asking right now. Do you think this is just a smart career move for Sophie Cunningham? Or is this the beginning of a whole new era in women's basketball media where players become just as influential off the court as they are on it? Because that's really what this comes down to. A shift in power, a shift in visibility, and maybe even a shift in how fans connect with the game itself. Some people are going to see this as progress, more voices, more personality, more access to the game from inside the locker room perspective. Others might see it as a blur between sports and entertainment that changes what broadcasting is supposed to look like. But either way, one thing is clear. This isn't slowing down. The WNBA is growing. The audience is expanding, and the spotlight is getting brighter every season. And moves like this are going to keep happening, whether people are ready for them or not. So now I want to hear from you. Do you like the idea of active players stepping into media roles like this while still competing? Or do you think broadcasting should stay strictly for retired legends and full-time analysts? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns like this, covering the real stories behind the headlines, the reactions, and everything happening inside sports culture, make sure you stay tuned, because the next story is already building behind the scenes. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you don't want to miss what's coming next, and I'll see you in the next one.